The sun sat low and flat on the plain, a dry coin of light that made iron glint and faces hard. Dust breathed along the ground like a slow old animal. In the center of the assembly a woman knelt, her ankles bound with iron that had bitten into her skin until the edges were dark with old rust and new blood. Her head was bowed so that a sun-scorched braid hid the raw line where a rope had rubbed. The breath that rose from her was even. She had learned steadiness, the way one learns how to stand on a roof in a windstorm, because there was no other lesson left. They called her Mara Redfern, and in the speech of the elders, her name was not a person so much as a ledger entry, an allotment, a price. Chief Talon Grey stood nearest, his shoulders broader than the rest, a statue that knew how to look like law. Around him, men in plain shirts and riders with the clean, spare faces of those who spend their days reading land rather than people shifted their weight and watched like a jury waiting for a gavel to drop. A dozen silent watchers filled the wide circle. Traders who came for water and grazing, ranch hands with sun-cracked hands, elders whose eyes had learned how to make regret look like policy. The council had the feel of an old wound dressed in ceremony. Talon spoke with the soft, ritual cadence of one who believes rules keep the world from eroding into chaos. "You came for water," he said to the newcomer before the crowd could turn his name into a story. His voice carried easily in the dry air. "A fair trade for the river rights. We give you pasture without dispute. You give us cattle, goods we need. There are terms." Cole Barrett had arrived that morning with a ledger, a map rolled like a promise under his arm, and a look that betrayed the habit of someone who keeps his distance as a practical matter. Rain had not touched his ranch in a season, and negotiations were not supposed to involve people on chains. He had expected barbed offers and a clear yes or no, not the wordless place where history and hunger met. He had been 20 yards away when he saw the iron and the braid. The sun drew every line of her face into a map he did not know how to read, yet. He had seen men and women wronged before. He had not seen a living person reduced to bargaining chip in broad daylight. A trader beside him muttered something about precedent and the hands that hold power. Cole did not move then. He let the wind tell him what anger looked like. Loose, patient, inevitable. Chief Talon stepped forward and pointed to the kneeling woman. "We will withhold pasture until compensation is made. The ledger balances, Mr. Barrett. This is custom and necessity. Take her as part of terms for the river." There was a silence like a held breath. Someone scoffed softly. A rancher near Cole's wagon called, "Is that your water then, Talon? Or just your idea of order?" The words were sharper than he meant them to be. Cole felt the ledger under his arm, parchment and ink that could not speak for flesh. He saw the sheen on Mara's cheek, where sweat had mixed with dust, the way her jaw tightened, not in plea but in calculation. For reasons that had begun with the small, guilty memory of the night he'd stood by and not helped his own failing wife, Cole felt the room tilt. He had long trained himself to act like a man who measures losses, who knows when a fight costs too much. He had also, for a long time, lived with the ache that measures a different price, the cost of looking away. He stepped forward. The crowd parted in a rough, involuntary channel. For a moment his boots were the only sound. People watched him as they do when someone decides to move the world a little. Chief Talon inclined his head as if to accept the exchange as a settled thing. "It is simple," he said. "You keep the cattle and the water is unhindered. You refuse, and there will be consequences for your trade here." Cole could have named the consequences. There were routes that would close, merchants who would find other ranches to favor, hands who would refuse to work for him. But the ledger under his arm felt suddenly ridiculous, ink and rules against a woman in iron. He put his hand on his satchel, felt the leather cool, and said without ceremony, "I'll take her." The 3 words fell like a small stone into the quiet. It was the sort of sentence that rewrites the map in a single line. For an instant, no one breathed. Chief Talon lifted his chin. A few men laughed, the thin laugh of people who expect the world to keep doing what it has always done. "You'll pay the price," Talon said, "or the consequences." Cole met his eyes. "I'll pay whatever price is on the table. She's not a token." Someone at the back of the circle murmured, audible enough to gather more voices, "Traitor." The word was a gust, short, hot, and wild. It landed as accusation. The man was picking a side not only against custom, but against kin. He was choosing something that would make him an outcast in certain lines of trade, a pariah to the old bargains. Cole let the word find him, and did not flinch. He thought of his wife, Lydia, who had once been all the ledger he had needed, until sickness and silence taught him otherwise. The memory of leaving her in the hospital while men in suits decided about land and cattle sat in his chest like an ember. He had been a practical man then. Now the ember flared into something that made him move. They untied Mara's hands, with hands that were rough but steady, Cole's hands among them. Iron came away in the sound of a small breaking. Skin opened to air, and she breathed like someone who had learned the taste of being alive again. Cole offered her water from a canteen, held it with the easy, respectful distance he had learned in households where people do not presume. She drank slowly, eyes narrowed in assessment. Her voice when she first spoke was level, contained, a blade that had been honed to keep people from seeing the rawness beneath. "You had the ledger," she said. "Do not call it by any softer name." He set the canteen down and did not press questions. Freeing her was sudden, like pulling a stone from a shoe, but the shoe had a heap of sand inside it, and every footstep since had been an accommodation. The rescue was tender and urgent, the soft, confessing clink of chains, the wash of water over dust-grimed skin, the finding of clothing that had not been shredded into a thing beyond repair. As they stood, the crowd murmured in a way that had nothing to do with weather. Men clustered and whispered about trade routes and about the mule trains that would avoid the Barrett brand. Women in the crowd held to themselves tighter, their eyes not on the ledger but on the person who had been unbound. Cole looked at Mara as if gauging whether she would run. She did not move away. Her shoulders showed both wariness and a fierce, guarded steadiness. He thought then of the way her jaw set, the way grief had become a pragmatic instrument inside her, the way she did not ask to be rescued, but rather accepted an offered arm as one accepts a bridge. "Why did you come back?" he asked finally, not wanting to assume anything. Mara's eyes slid over him, measured him like the rest, then found a point in the dust between them. "Because if I leave," she said, "others remain." The words drew a low, uncomfortable sound from some of the elders. Cole had assumed rescue would be a private thing, an exchange of one chain for something lighter. He had not expected indictment. He had not expected her to refuse the path that leads to safety. "She speaks of 6 women," whispered a young man near the circle, before anyone had consented to that admission. The name floated like an accusation. Lila Stone, Nora Ash, Miraval, Nia Reed, Elisa Down, Seraphine Flint. When Mara heard the whisper, she did not correct it. She did not need to. The knowledge was already wrapped tight in her like a second skin. Cole's mouth tightened. The saving of one had made visible the imprisonment of 6. The ledger had many columns. The sun leaned lower. The light slashed across faces and made private thoughts look like public sin. Mara turned her face toward the council. "I will not leave," she said, "not until the others are named, not until they are seen." Talon's expression did not change, but a very small motion crossed his face, like a tremor beneath a mask. He missed nothing. A man like him weighed power the way others weigh coin. To admit harm made the ledger inconveniently messy. In public, systems resist change the way rock resists rain. "You speak of law," Talon said. We have ways. The council determines when private matters become public. Mara drew breath, and Cole felt the whole plane hold as if it were listening. Then let it be public, she said. We will hold a trial. If you want to make this a thing of trade, then let the people decide. The request tightened the circle. Trials were public, they were dangerous, they were a way to drag private shame into broad daylight. For those who had profited or had reasons to keep certain things in the margins, public truth was a threat. Cole found his hands clenched at his sides. It was one thing to remove a woman from iron, another to agree to go into the maw of the town's law and make enemies there. He had not expected to be the kind of man who would voluntarily pick a fight with a town. Yet watching Mara stand, he felt compelled by something that had outgrown prudence. A debt born from the memory of Lydia's quiet failing and his own inertness during those long nights. If he had left then, he would have to live with the knowledge. To be unmoored in a way that cost reputation and coin seemed at that moment preferable to a life of not knowing he had tried. Public trial, he said aloud, slow enough that the words were not a command, but a deliberate acceptance. We'll have it public. There it was, the promise that set events moving like water find its natural slope. A man in the crowd spat. "You'll burn your own bridges, Barrett," he said. "You'll be out of business." "They'll call you traitor," someone else said. This time, the word was not a whisper, but a prediction flung like a stone. Cole let the label hang in the air. If they wanted a name, they could have it. He had learned early in life that to accept a name is sometimes to free the thing attached to it. He had learned that certain losses are the cost of other gains. Mara's voice was softer when she spoke then, but every syllable carried like a bell. "I will speak of what I remember. I will give names. I will not let them hide." She looked at the elders, at Chief Talon, not supplicating but making a claim. "You can take my life if you must, but you cannot keep these women in the dark." The crowd shifted, faces flushed. A woman in the front row, a farmer with flour on her hands, made a small sound and covered her mouth. The politics of shame are not only public, they reach into living rooms and kitchens where people who have kept silent now find the courage to look. Cole walked Mara to the little shed behind his wagon, where a bed lay folded, and a cloth was draped over an old wooden chair. He insisted she wash, brought clean clothes, and did the small, practical things with the same steady hands that would later hold a rifle or steady livestock, hands that knew labor was a kind of love. She accepted them without thanks, but not without looking at him in a way that catalogued him as a person rather than as a principle. That evening, as the campfire's orange smeared the horizon, Cole unrolled the map on his knees and did the thing that men in his line of work do to feel like the world is still manageable. He laid a plan. He measured routes with a stick and ticked off names that would matter. But plans are only as good as the commitments that back them. Cole's map could not account for the way a community protects itself by silence, for the way men will choose convenience over courage. Mara watched him draw lines and did not interrupt until he folded the map again. "You keep a ledger," she said, not unkindly. "You know what numbers look like. Do not make my life another column." He met her gaze. "I know what it is to measure things I cannot understand until they are gone." She was quiet for a long beat. Then she asked, "Why help me? Why risk losing cattle and trade routes?" For a moment Cole looked away, toward the horizon, where the sky hollowed into the shape of a night. He remembered Lydia in the days before sickness took the light from her eyes, how she had once beaten him at cards just to see him laugh. He remembered how he had stood at the edge of the hospital room and let the world keep its distance because it was easier than asking for help. The memory was raw enough that his jaw tightened. "My wife," he said low. "She got sick and I chose the practical course. I did what my neighbors would say a good man did. I made arrangements. I paid the bills. I signed the papers. I was more intent on keeping things running than on staying with her. I found ways to say I did enough. I didn't. I left. That error sits in me. The confession did not excuse him. It explained why he moved now. Sometimes you get a second chance to undo a kind of wrong, Cole said. Not all wrongs can be fixed, but some can be tried to be made right. This is one of them. Mara listened. The light of the fire caught her face, and for a moment she looked like someone who had been carved from stone and then softened by water. She did not soften her stance. She was not a woman looking to receive pity, but there was something in her eyes that accepted the honesty. "You will be called traitor," she said quietly. "If you are thinking of the ways men will turn on you, do not let that stop you." He didn't flinch at the prediction this time. "I have a ledger of my own," he said. "It has debts I have tried not to count. If people call me names, I have room for them." Outside the encampment, the plain breathed under the stars. The wheels of wagons clicked quietly as men secured their loads. The world, Cole thought, had long been a series of adjustments, bending one way or another until equilibrium was maintained. Mara's insistence on going back flipped a stone in a bed of shifting pebbles. Word travelled before the sun rose. Riders left as if on the current of rumour, and returned with the resolve of men who do not like their arrangements disturbed. Talon's council convened again in the open field under the blazing noon. They were calm in the way of those who believe the rules of the old ways are the last safeguard against chaos. Yet within the folds of their robes and the creases of their faces, there were men and women who had seen their own private compromises and harboured quiet questions. "Let us be clear," said Amos Crow, one of the elders, voice like dry soil. "This is not a foreign affair. There are customs here. We have laws we have kept for years. The notion of changing them for the sake of one woman is radical." A dissenting voice cut through. Wade Flint, whose hands were ink-stained from ledgers, but whose eyes were less sure. "We have kept things in the dark so the wheels of trade could turn. People have been hurt. We cannot call that good governance." Silas Reed, who had the slow face of someone accustomed to making decisions matter-of-factly, leaned forward. "If this goes to trial, evidence will be presented. If we have nothing to hide, we should not fear the light." Murmurs in the crowd turned wind-like. Somewhere in the outskirts, merchants making deals in the shade shifted where they sat. A trade agreement's currency is not only coin, but reputation. Cole could feel the room assessing the cost. Looking at Chief Talon, he saw a man who had the look of someone who had learned how to hold consequence like a shield, practiced at deflecting blame into customs rather than himself. The word traitor found Cole in other tongues now too, among ranchers, in passing grocery stores, in the clipped notes of men who thought themselves custodians of a rugged order. His name collected scorn, as if by habit. Those who had expected him to be expedient in business now began to cite him as an example of imprudence. The small talk of a town can turn into a verdict without a court. Still, Mara insisted on returning. She would not be led away in the night and salved with the promise of a quiet life. She would stand and she would speak. Cole, who knew what it was to feel the slow corrosion of failing to act, understood. He would be her witness. He would stand in the doorway of whatever followed and not shrink. Weary hands strapped gear. Guns were cleaned in the shade, though no one sought violence as a first recourse, and words were rehearsed with the dry, exacting patience of those who will tell a truth that hurts. Mara sat with a handful of others who had names and faces, and in the low light of the stable she wrote. She kept a small ledger of details, dates and names and places where chains had been tightened, where a door had closed on a child's cry. She would not keep everything. Memory is a house large enough only for what can be carried. The rumor of the trial had a way of making even small people feel larger. Neighbors who had taken comfort in silence began to watch. A seamstress who had mended coats for years found a courage she had not known she kept and agreed to testify if called. John Ash, whose name had precious currency in the settlement, offered to stand at Mara's side. A woman named Selah Down, whose son had been beaten for asking too many questions, stepped forward to say she would speak for what she had seen. Cole heard these names and felt the weight of them. These were not abstractions. These were living testimonies about other lives that had been kept under the floorboards. The danger in unearthing them was clear. To speak now would break quiet pacts, would alienate men who had trusted Cole's prudence. But the alternative was to leave scars, to fester. On the morning they rode to town, Cole took a breath that smelled of horses and dust, and that felt like a hinge. People lined the route, some with curiosity, others with the thin interest of those watching a fire that might not touch their own barns. A group of ranchers at the edge of the road did not hide their scorn. One of them spat a little way off and muttered something about a man who would throw away his name. "You'll be no better than the outcast who's come to sermonize on our debts," he said loud enough for Cole to hear. "When the markets close, you'll be the ghost we all point at and say, 'See what happens to those who choose the wrong side.'" Cole let the words wash over him. He had held doubts the way some men carry stones in their pockets, to test their weight and to remind themselves they are real. But the ledger of his conscience had begun to list casualties that were not his alone, and the arithmetic was sharp. When they reached the square, the town's faces were a quilt of suspicion and curiosity. Stalls were half-manned, windows were shaded and then lifted to see what the fuss was about. A hush settled as Mara and Cole made their way to the wooden platform the townsfolk used for proclamations. Men who had spent their lives arguing about grazing rights now watched what would look to them like two people trying to tear an old page from the book of their lives. At this point, the stakes changed from theoretical to immediate. Cole felt something in the crowd shift, a pressure that is not quite fear and not quite hope. People stand in the square as if waiting for permission to rearrange their lives. The presence of the women, the names of those who had been hidden, the confession of Cole's past. These were all small fires touching tinder. Before any formal words were given, a group of riders arrived, men Talon had sent to reclaim what the council said belonged to them. They approached with the air of those who have been given orders and see the world in simple terms: right and wrong, possession and restitution. Their leader rode forward and called to Talon, smoothing a line between obligation and enforcement. Talon's face was unreadable. He had the look of a man who calculates the cost of changing precedent and finds it high. Yet the council had footnotes and dissenters. Not all who sat with him would support the old line. Mara climbed to the platform with Cole at her side. The town murmured, and she looked out at the faces as if they were a map she intended to read aloud. Her voice carried then, not the quiet of someone used to being unseen, but the steady tone of someone who has rehearsed truth until it is not wounding, but illuminating. "I will name them," she began. "Lila Stone, Nora Ash, Miraval, Naya Reed, Elisa Down, Seraphine Flint. These women were taken and held, some for months, some for years. We asked to have their names spoken, their stories told, and for the council to decide in the light." A hush pulled over the square like a blanket being drawn. For every person who had believed silence was a favor, there was now the unavoided fact of the names. They acted like mirrors. Some faces paled, others looked away, mouth tight. A few, lower in the crowd, started to cry softly. "You will call him traitor," someone behind Cole said, low but audible. The accusation felt less like a personal attack than a promise. When a community chooses a scapegoat, it binds itself to a narrative that is easy to hold. Cole had been ready for that. He had not expected it to land with such weight, though. A man's reputation is sometimes the only inheritance he can leave. To lose it is to be unmoored. He understood that now in a way that he had only half understood before. He turned to Mara. She looked back with the tired, hard kindness of someone who has already borne worse things and made room for more to come. "Do what you must," she said. "If they call you traitor, let the word be honest." Cole felt the square tilt beneath him. A dozen hands gripped the rail as if to steady themselves against a tidal change. The riders at the edge of the crowd shifted, and their leader loped forward, boots thudding on the wooden planking, to demand that Mara be returned forthwith. "You can't," the word came from the leader with the blunt rhythm of threatened men. "You can't let her speak. She belongs to the council until such time as compensation is arranged." Mara met him without fear. "I belong to no ledger." Her words cut and did not falter. "I belong to myself and to those who have names and faces in towns like this. This is where they must be heard." The leader's jaw flexed. A hand went to his holster, but did not find its comfort. He was a man whose reflexes had been trained in a world where threats were met with violence before words. Here, in the square, with witnesses gathering and with Cole standing where he stood, the calculus felt different. For a flash of slow time, the square hung as if on an invisible hinge. Then one of Talon's own rose and stepped closer. Wade Flint, who had spoken earlier. He did not speak for Talon. He spoke for something else, the small, hard thing inside men who have seen consequences and prefer light to festering rot. "If we hide what has been done to our people," Wade said plainly, "we become the thing we pretend to prevent. We can choose a different path." The words were not popular with everyone. A group of merchants in fine coats shifted, and someone hissed an insult about the breakdown of order. Cole heard murmurs of traitor again, and the syllable hit him like a cold wind. It was not merely a name, it was a binding promise that he would be isolated. He thought of barring routes and of calluses turning into pensionless solitude. He thought of leaving his land, of how the valley had become his identity and his obligations. And yet when he looked at Mara, when he saw the line of women who might be freed because her voice rose now, the choice was clear enough. A man can measure losses and sometimes decide which ones are tolerable. Cole had been counting debts for years. He could accept being counted as enemy of a small, jealous order if it meant others were given light. The square began to hum with the sound of a town confronting itself. People who had been willing to nod away dull injustice found their faces pulled tight with the recognition that choices demanded more than silence. Women who had learned to keep their heads bowed now lifted them. Children stared wide-eyed at the ornament of a public truth being made. Cole, feeling the weight of the label already trying to shape him, steadied his hand on the rail. If he became a traitor, it would be because he chose a different tribe, one made of people whose names could not be traded away. He heard the press of leather as riders tightened their reins, the shuffling of many feet that turned a public square into an arena of decision. Mara's hand brushed his sleeve, a tiny, almost private claim. "If it comes to cost," she said, "know that I did not ask you to give your life, only to stand." Cole's lips pressed together. He had said earlier that he had debts. Lydia's name sat behind his teeth like a last quiet regret. He would not, could not, promote himself as martyr. He would try to be what was needed, a witness, a protector, someone who would not look away. But even that would be labeled treason by men who fear change. From the edge of the crowd came a low, common voice, a rancher whose name was known for being mercilessly blunt. "Then make your case," he spat. "Let the town see if what you call justice is anything but disruption." The council conferred. Voices rose and fell in the way councils do when the rooms are full of old arrangements trying to keep their shape. Cole felt every eye in the square touch him, as if to say, "Now that you have stepped off the map, where will you land?" He looked over at Mara and found the small curve at the corner of her mouth, the hint of a laugh that had refused to be erased by iron. "We will not be quiet," she said. "We will not let names be hidden." The moment waited. The sun lay down a flat, clean light over the town, like a witness. Men in coats shifted. Women suppressed stewarding customs. Children in the back peered, their mouths a close O at the drama of adults reshaping what they would accept as true. Cole realized then the exact shape of the consequence he had invited, a kind of exile that hollowed out the easy commerce of his life. People would whisper "traitor" in his presence like a verdict. He might lose roots, market favors, maybe even the trust of men who had been friends. He might be ostracized in precisely the ways that hurt practical men the most. The thought did not stop him. He had paid enough in inaction. The cost of not trying to fix a wrong now had become heavier than the possible ruin of his reputation. He would stand in the square and not shrink. If the town called him traitor, it would be because he had chosen the human over the ledger. The council rose to announce a day for the trial, a public hearing with witnesses, named and sworn. Murmurs like small stones skittered through the crowd. Cole felt the press of attention like a rope around his ribs. He thought of Lydia again, and of the small mercy that came from finally answering the ledger with an action that matched the admission in his chest. As the crowd began to disperse into a town suddenly charged with the knowledge of its own complicity, a rider returned with news. Additional men were on the road, riders Talon had sent to ensure no one could move too freely. Their presence was not outright threat yet, but it was a reminder that the old ways had muscle and intention. Cole met Mara's eyes. "They'll call me traitor," he said softly, as a fact. "If they do," she replied, "they will also have to listen." That evening, the town slept under a sky pinpricked with indifferent stars, but the settlement's sleep was not peaceful. It was the kind of restless rest given to towns that have been told truths they did not want to hear. Men dreamed of fences and ledgers, women dreamed of doors opening. Cole sat by the wagon and mended a strap, the task calming something like a bell in his chest. He thought of the trial to come, and of the testimonies that would be asked. He thought of the 6 names and the lives they stood for. He had offered to be a witness and protector. Now the shape of what that meant began to fill with consequences. At the edge of the encampment, a thin ribbon of light showed the path of riders coming back. The rumble of hooves was the sound of a town deciding whether to defend the ways of old or to let a new light in. Cole felt the word traitor fold over him like a cloak, one that could be burned away by truth or worn until it defined him. He had chosen. The plane waited. The trial would come soon. Voices would be lifted. Some would turn on him and call him a traitor for choosing a side, his side of people, not profit. Others would step forward with names and wounds and a resolve that had been waiting in the dark. Cole tightened the strap and let the leather settle into his hands. The night was full of small noises, the creak of a wheel, the distant bark of a dog, the sigh of a world that is not fixed. He thought of Lydia's still face, and how the ledger had once told him to be practical. He thought, too, of the woman who had refused to flee and who would not let the names of others be buried. At dawn, they would stand in a square and speak. Men would call him traitor, people would make choices. The trial was a hinge, and neither side had yet found the exact angle that would determine whether the town changed. All that had been decided in that moment of unbinding was that the ledger would be opened. Cole slept little that night. When he finally lay down, he felt something like a quiet resolve settle into his bones. He would be counted out by some. He would be called a traitor before the day was done. If that name meant he had done the one thing his younger self had not, he would answer to it. The road to the square was long enough for doubt to catch up with men. As dawn crawled over the plain and horses stamped and the town assembled once more, voices gathered like thunder on the horizon. Cole tightened his belt and saw the line of riders approaching, their faces set like hard flint. He exchanged a look with Mara and felt the measure of that moment, an unspoken pact that neither would back away. The trial had not started yet. The decision had only been made. Public, unavoidable, messy as truth often is. People in the crowd shifted from passive spectators to hesitant participants. Cole watched as one of Talon's men. Harlan Boss, a man whose name had been spoken earlier as a dissenting elder, moved through the crowd and whispered, not to Talon but to Cole, "You know what's at stake. Be ready." Cole nodded. The word traitor hung like a promise. He had chosen. Whatever the cost, his sacrifice, whether reputational, social, or worse, would be made in the open where it mattered. He felt the thin hope that public truth might change the balance of power. As the square filled and the townsfolk pressed around the platform, a bell rang, a small, clear sound that carried across the plain. People fell silent. Talon took his place. Mara adjusted the braid at the nape of her neck and stepped forward. Cole, standing beside her, felt the press of faces like a tide-shaping stone. The platform creaked underfoot. The sun had climbed and laid a clean, implacable light over everything. He could feel the expectation roll across the crowd. Some hunger for spectacle, some fear of the truth, some private hope that what happened here might finally be named. Chief Talon Grey lifted his hand, old leather and the authority it carried. "We will hear testimony," he said, voice even as weathered leather. "We will listen, but let order be kept." The words were meant to still the square. They also bought him time to sort the costs. Mara stepped forward first, and when she did, the world narrowed to her voice. She did not open with blame or flourish. She spoke like someone reading a list of accounts, names, dates, places. Each syllable fit into a space left by the elder's careful language, and in that fitting, the truth made new angles in the town's old story. "My name is Mara Redfern," she said. "I was taken from the northern well on a night when 2 of their boys rode with too much coin and too little care. I was kept in a cellar where the light came through a crack like an accusation. I was made to work. I was told that my family's debts were my own debts to pay. I resisted. I was bound. I am here to tell you what that resistance cost." She named the 6 women: Lila Stone, Nora Ash, Miraval, Naya Reed, Elisa Down, Seraphine Flint, then added details that were neither prying nor sentimental, details meant to orient memory and the legal mind, the years when a single well had been taken as payment, the names of men who had signed for them with small, polite ink, the nights when guards were posted as if gatekeeping a ledger. The effect was clinical and human at once. The square tilted as private silence became public record. Sela Down was called forward next. She walked with the stoop of someone who had carried too many small things alone and who had finally set them down for other hands to hold. Her voice cracked at the start, then steadied. "My boy came home with a black eye and a story he was too young to tell," she said. "He would not say the men's names. I went where mothers go when looking for lost things, and was told it was not my place to know. I learned of a cellar because a neighbor, ashamed and older than her pride, could not let the truth sit like a festering wound. I came because a mother's silence is a different kind of crime." There was a hush so deep that the creak of the platform sounded obscene. Faces shifted, people reached for familiar certainties and found them loosened. Jonash followed. He was a small man of quick gestures, someone who had taken his share of hardship and then been punished for asking questions. He told of a night when he had tried to bring food to a cousin and been turned away by men, with the look of men who were used to making decisions outside law. "I was threatened," he said plainly, "told to mind my trades and leave it be. I saw the door a crack open and an arm pass a sack through. I heard a woman hum. I have had enough small silences." His testimony threaded through the square like a slow, insistent needle. People who had been willing to believe the old equilibrium, laws that tended to the strong, silence that cushioned families, felt the fabric tear. The evidence was not theatrical, it was stubbornly ordinary. Names, dates, small decisions that accumulated into a pattern. Talon listened with the air of a man who holds authority as if it were a tool, and not a burden. He asked questions in the measured manner of leaders who know how to phrase doubt like a net. Not all questions were meant to unsettle the truth. Some were meant to make it sit in place so the community could see what it had been tolerating. When the town opened for counter-testimony, a chorus rose against Cole. Merchants from the traders' line, men who had favored him with contracts and who understood trade routes as lifeblood, stepped forward with a different ledger. "This man," said one, voice edged with a commerce-shaped hurt, "has refused the customs that let us do business. He has set himself against a settlement order that keeps the markets moving. We ask, who will take him for his acts when trade turns away? Who takes the heat from us?" A rancher, his hat rinsed and sunburned, spat a single word loud enough for many to hear. "Traitor!" It landed like an accusation flung as a stone. Short, loud, designed to find purchase in the ready cracks of a community, trying to make sense of someone who had stepped out of the usual line. Cole did not answer with anger. His face was small against the square's hunger. Instead, he told a truth he had not invented. The ledger of his own life, the one that had borne Lydia's small rebellion, and then her absence. He spoke of the hospital room, of how he had become a man who balanced bills better than he had balanced bedside hours. The confession had the odd effect of making him simpler to understand and harder to dismiss. He did not ask for forgiveness. He offered explanation and the proof of his present choice. "You call me traitor," he said. "Call me what your need for a clear villain requires. But if standing in the square, naming a wrong that costs names makes me traitor, I will be counted. I will also stand as witness when names have to be spoken." The square grumbled. Some nodded, quietly relieved to have a category for what felt threatening. Others watched with the faint, unfinished hope of people who did not yet know whether they would follow truth or custom. As testimonies continued, there were moments of quiet clarity, as when a seamstress swore to mend a woman's dress free of charge if she ever needed it, and moments of raw human detail, as when a father proved with a belt a mark he could no longer hide. The mood teetered between a weight pressing for justice and the old solidity of routine. Then the riders at the periphery moved. They came with the quiet precision of men who are used to being given orders. The leader, one of Talon's men, his face a flat slate of duty, dismounted and addressed the platform as if he spoke for inevitability. "We were sent to reclaim the woman," he said. "Custom compels us. The council has the power to enforce its decision. If she is to be taken as compensation, that will be done." Mara turned and faced them as if measuring weather. "You were sent to take me," she said. "I was not goods. I will not be returned like a tool of trade. If you believe the council has power, bring your claims to light. Let them be tested where everyone can see." The rider's jaw tightened. He put a hand to his holster, as if to say the argument could be settled with the easier language of force. Cole's pulse amplified that unspoken logic. He could feel the old circuits closing, the reflex to protect property, the reflex to enforce what keeps markets moving. In the square, the possibility of violence pulsed like a second heartbeat. "Do not reach for a weapon," Cole said quietly. It was a plea tempered by threat, the kind men use when they mean calmly and absolutely that there will be a cost if the simple way is chosen. Someone in the crowd, angry, afraid, unwilling to let the moment pass into complexity, thrust forward. A man from the merchant line, flushed with indignation, shouted that the council's decision must be upheld. He accused Cole of stirring trouble for the sake of his own conscience. At his side, one of Cole's old trading partners, Ben Holcomb, who had once softened a rough negotiation with a cigar and a handshake, stepped forward not to denounce him, but to mock the cost. "You choose people over profit," Ben said, voice full of both claim and pity. "You will find that the ledger is unforgiving. The rider moved his hand toward the weapon again. This time, a different sound cut through the square, the clink of iron against wood, a small noise that announced a sudden and physical crossing of a boundary. Anybody who had practiced violence had learned that the right hand takes precedence over argument. Now, hands were moving in a different rhythm. Cole stepped forward and used his body the way men of his kind had learned in 100 years of keeping others safe, as a shield. He put himself between Mara and the rider and said quietly, "If you would take her by force, you will take me first." The rider made a decision in a blink. Most decisions are made. He fired. The shot was a clean report that cracked the square's veneer of civility like a dropped cup. A man in the crowd sputtered and reached for his hat. Cole jerked, the leather of his coat snapping as the bullet found flesh. He dropped to the platform, a sound somewhere between a thud and a human folding, then lay there with crimson blooming like a hard sun on the wood. For a long second, the world collapsed into the bright, obscene clarity of blood and the suddenness of what had been done. People gasped, mothers put hands to their mouths and cried out. The riders froze, the momentum of their orders snagged on the raw, immediate cost. Mara did not scream. She moved, the way someone trained in the economy of urgency moves, fast, efficient, God and not spectacle in every motion. She leaned over Cole and called for cloth and water. Junash pushed forward with a blanket, Sela down with a vial of spirit. Hands belonged to one another in the square now in a new way. The previous political calculation evaporated into a human scramble. "Call a healer!" someone shouted. The town clerk, whose everyday work had been ink and ledgers rather than blood, ransacked his satchel and found a cloth. Mara pressed it to Cole's wound. He was pale, sweating through the dust and sun. His eyes slipped closed and opened on a world that had narrowed to a single important thing, the weight of what had been chosen. A hush settled in that way only a wound can force. The rider who had fired sat back on his heels as if he had been surprised at the fullness of his action. Talon Grey's face changed in a way that was more human than any council ritual could make him. Something like fear crossed it, fear at the price of enforcing old customs with new blood. "This is on me," the shooter said finally, voice small and thin. The authority drained because the consequences had been made suddenly, brutally personal. In the square, the calculations that had seemed mainly theoretical, the cost of choosing sides, opened into an account where the currency was flesh. People who had been shouting only moments before turned to see the man on the platform who had been called a traitor, lying wounded for the thing he had chosen to do. The word traitor began to sound thin in the face of a bleeding man. Voices that had used it like a tidy explanation found it awkward now, lodged in mouths that did not want to use it while a man bled. It was Harlan Boss who first moved into the immediate moral vacuum. He was no sentimentalist. His life had been built on the kind of practicality that makes a town run. Yet he looked at the wound and then at Talon and said with a surprising fierceness, "We will not let a man die for something that can be righted with law. If this is our cost for order, then I do not want our order. We cannot be a people who write human ledger entries in blood." Wade Flint, who had been one of Talon's quieter dissenters, added his voice, sharp, steady. "If we allow enforcement to be coupled with blood, we lose the right to ask of our children that they inherit a just place. There is a law to be made. If Cole Barrett must be a martyr for truth, then shame on us for letting it come to that. But if we can prevent further blood, we must." The square changed its angle. Where once the merchant's ledger and the council's custom had made sense, now the wound made the moral calculation immediate. Men who had been eager to pronounce Cole a traitor now found their hands empty of the certainty they had needed. The term could still be used as a weapon, but the weapon now left the wielder open to question. Chief Talon stood with the slow gravity of a man who knew how to make decisions after the easy ones had been exhausted. He looked at Cole, at Mara, at the crowd, and finally at the rider who had fired. "This council will not be ruled by blood," he said, voice low. "We will hear further. No one will be taken by force while I sit." It was a small mercy, an order, a temporary halt, but it did not unmake what had happened. Cole's wound was a public fact. The square was now marked by the visible cost of the old arrangements. People who had believed the custom could be maintained by ritual found themselves confronting the reality that enforcing that custom might mean killing a man from their own trading houses. A murmur rose into a careful debate as the townsfolk split into those who wanted immediate vengeance and those who now feared the precedent of spilling blood in the name of tradition. The elders retreated, as elders do, to parley and to measure how to frame the next steps. Talon called for a vote to decide whether the laws that permitted women to be treated as barter would be reconsidered, whether the council would accept testimony as causes rather than commodities. The vote that followed was not unanimous. It was not even comfortable. Wade Flint, Harlan Boss, and a handful of others voted to open the code, to rewrite the custom that had allowed ledger logic to trump human life. Amos Crow hesitated, torn between his understanding of the practical benefits of the old order and a dawning sense that the justice he had helped maintain had been thin and brittle. Silas Reed, with a voice that had the authority of habit, argued that a public law that placed women beyond barter would strengthen the town's moral claim and keep merchants safe in the long run. Ellie Sage, who had watched families for years and learned how silence breeds harm, spoke plainly for compassion. There were votes against. Some elders worried about economic fallout, about routes that would close, and businessmen who would turn their backs. A few, whose names had been murmured earlier in private, held to old habits, as if they offered certainty where the world had become nuanced. When the votes were counted, the motion to free the women and to begin rewriting the customs that allowed such trade passed by a narrow margin. It was not the triumph of the righteous, energetic, and impatient. It was the hard arithmetic of a community deciding a future at the sight of a bleeding man. Cole's wound did not change that arithmetic by itself. It made the cost immediate and public. It reframed the moral calculus in a way that talk alone could not. Men who would have preferred to avoid bread-and-blood responsibility found that they could not, under the bright sun and with a man's blood staining the platform, continue to treat people like entries. Talon Grey, his voice heavy with the weight of governance, pronounced the decision. The council would free the named women, begin a process to reform the customs that permitted their captivity, and institute a public registry of claims so that no person could be treated like a ledger entry without due cause and oversight. He also declared an immediate cessation of enforced seizure while a new adjudication process could be written. Murmurs swelled, then softened. Tears flowed from corners of faces where grief had lived unspoken. Some in the crowd raised hands to test the change, like someone touching water to see if it was warm. Cole remained unconscious for a long while. He was tended in the town's small infirmary, a place more accustomed to mending broken tools and bruised arms than tending a wound that had become symbol and test. Mara sat at his bedside and watched lines on his face shift with the slow, deliberate mechanics of healing. Cellar Down brought broth. John Ash sat in a chair and kept vigil. People who had once branded him a traitor quietly came to bring him comforts. Some came because they had been shaken into seeing, some because conscience demanded it. News travels in particular ways through settlements. Merchants who had once spat the word traitor now found their customers sympathetic to the Cole who had bled. Some withdrew their condemnation, not because they had changed their principles, but because violence had made consequence a thing they could not abide. Others doubled down, sealing off routes as if to punish what they still called folly. Cole woke eventually to the soft light of late afternoon and the sight of Mara's face leaning close. His eyes found hers, and for a moment the square and the votes and the blood receded into the background. "You," he began, voice raw. "You were foolish," she said, but there was warmth in the charge. She would not let sentiment erase the cost, and she would not let gratitude become debt. You made it hard for them to pretend. Cole managed a rough, humorless laugh. Then I did something useful, he said. Pain laced the words, but they were his. In the days that followed, the council's decision unfolded into concrete steps. The names of the 6 women were sought out, and teams were sent to the places where they had been kept. Authorities found buildings and lockboxes, and the small bureaucratic signatures that had enabled wrongdoing. A registry was drafted that required public justification for any transfer that involved people, the kind of detail that had once been considered laughably cumbersome, but now stood as a legal wall against the old abuses. The 6 women were freed in ways that respected their agency. They were brought to the town under protection, offered choices, given time and space. Lila Stone returned to the place where she had been raised and sat in a kitchen as her mother sobbed and apologized in a way that had the shape of a confession. Nora Ash walked into a yard where children played and found a son who had grown into a man who had learned to be brave in small ways. Miraval chose to travel to a community center where she could learn trades she had been denied. Nia Reed found people who would teach her to read. Elisa Down cried in Sella's arms for the child she had lost in the silence of captivity. The town did not make easy promises, but it promised care and shared what small resources it had. Seraphine Flint, who had been obsessed with the defense of family honor, found a councilwoman who listened and who vowed that honor need not be paid in the currency of human lives. The process was not without pushback. Merchants tried to form a coalition to sanction Cole's ranch. Some ranch hands, loyal to old bargains, quietly accepted employment elsewhere. A few elders who had opposed the vote spoke of long-term consequences in ways that had the ring of a threat. But the writing of law is slow, and the immediate harm had been done. The town had to prevent another platform stained with blood. Cole's sacrifice, he had taken a bullet that day and borne the cost, became a public ledger entry of a different kind. He was, in the private parlance of certain men, a ruinous fool. In the public eye, he was both that and something else, a witness who had refused to turn away. He was branded and blessed in equal measure. Wherever he went, the word traitor followed him like a shadow. At the same time, people who had once used trade as a shield came to offer help, because they could not unsee what had been burned into their memory. Mara never let what had happened become a debt that required her to be grateful in ways that made her less free. She insisted on practices that centered the freed women, counseling available without shame, apprenticeships funded by the council, and a public registry that meant a woman's name could not be taken as if it were an asset. She pressed the council to treat the process not as an isolated episode, but as a necessary institutional shift. The council, chastened and uneven, began to include women's voices in its meetings. There were tentative steps at first, one woman allowed to speak during a debate, a woman appointed as advisor on the new registry. But those small openings widened. Wade Flint and Harlan Boss became advocates in the council for processes that would include women in adjudication and for penalties for those who trafficked in human lives. Talon Grey, whose pride had been great and whose guilt had been heavier, spoke quietly in council chambers of how he had once made choices to keep order and had not understood order could be unjust. 6 months later, the settlement looked both familiar and different. The bridge over the small river that separated the traders' quarter from the main plain had been repaired and painted. It was a literal piece of work that everyone could see, a small emblem of the mending the town had tried to practice. The registry sat in the clerk's office like a stubborn book of care, and its pages were not the same as the ledgers that had once turned people into entries. A place called the Common House opened, an old feed store refurbished with the help of voluntary labor and a small fund. It offered skills training, quiet rooms for women who needed space, and a small library that included books for those, like Miraval, who wanted to learn trades that would not be under a man's thumb. Celadon ran the kitchen some days, quietly, with a cross-shouldered practical authority. Jonash took up work helping to rebuild fences, his hands steady, his conscience eased by action. Mara moved between places with a new freedom. She returned to Cole's ranch sometimes, not out of obligation, but because she chose it. She taught at the common house some days, teaching younger women the small mechanics of trade and survival and the broader grammar of civic life. How to speak in council, how to demand names be read aloud, how to refuse to be a ledger entry. She did not become an emblem. She was a person who had insisted other people be named and who still used her voice to carve path for others. Cole recovered in ways that carried cost. The wound had scarred his side. He moved with the polite attention of a man who had been reminded of mortality. He could do the work he had always done, but some things had shifted. Hands that had once eagerly come to buy cattle paused and weighed whether to be associated with the Barrett brand. It was, in many ways, a new ledger of social consequence. He still bore the name Traitor in certain conversations, and some men in taverns would smirk and tell stories of the day he threw away his reputation. But other men now told a different story, the story of a man who had been willing to take a bullet so that women could be freed. Those stories circulated too, slowly, like a different coin. Between them, Mara and Cole developed a relationship that was slow and practical, and not driven by rescue myths. They shared tea as if it were a treaty, and they argued with the same honesty as they had spoken on the platform. There were moments of tenderness, hands finding hands while plaiting rope, a first kiss under the repaired bridge that came when neither expected it, and both had room to give it freely. There was no urgency to their closeness. What grew between them was mutual respect that had been earned, not owed. The freed women did not all choose the same paths. Some wanted to return to family, some wanted to leave the settlement and learn the trades they had missed. Some, like Seraphine, joined the newly formed council advisory board to make sure the law's letter matched the town's needs. The change was not a tidy fix. It was a long set of small acts, jobs taught in the common house, letters written to merchants asking for fair treatment, a young boy punished for mocking a freed woman and made to do public service as restitution. The elders met more often, and more people were given the chance to speak in public. The council's new registry was not perfect. It had flaws and loopholes that had to be closed. But the process of closing them had changed. No longer done behind curtains and ledgers, but in public and with voices that had once been silent. Cole still felt the sting when someone in the trade circuit called him traitor. He also felt the warm, awkward gratitude of people who had been saved from the habit of silence. The haters and scorners did not vanish. Their voices were part of the landscape, the same as the dust and the wind. But the town, because of the public cost and because of voices raised without shame, had begun to be different. One evening, 6 months from the day the platform had reddened, the town held a small gathering at dusk near the repaired bridge. Lanterns were hung, the light soft and careful. People moved with the tentative ease of those learning a new custom, to look each other in the eye and to say what needed saying. Talon Grey stood on the upper step with a staff in his hand, older and quieter. He did not make speeches filled with the self-righteousness of men who have never been forced to reckon. He spoke plainly. "We have always said we keep order because it prevents chaos," he began. "We have given law a power it did not deserve in the dark. We were wrong. We are wrong, and we will try to be less wrong in the days to come." He paused and looked at Cole, who stood a little to the side, his jacket mended, a line of scar showing where the shot had been. The crowd was small enough that the words would be heard. "Cole Barrett was called Traitor," Talon said. "He was called that by men who thought of loss as ledger and currency. He was also the man who refused to let names be kept in the dark. For that I cannot make amends fully, but I will say this. The council had something to answer for. and it has begun to answer. We will do better. The statement was not a salvation. It was, however, a necessary and public shifting of responsibility. People chewed over it in the hush afterward, the way dogs chew a bone. Some looked satisfied, some did not. Mara slipped her hand into Cole's. They walked to the edge of the bridge and leaned on the rail together. Below, water moved in its slow, patient business, indifferent to human scandal. But the surface reflected the lantern light, as if the world, for a heartbeat, had decided it wanted to be kinder. Cole looked at Mara and felt the old ledger loosen in his chest. "They still call me Traitor," he said, with a small, rueful smile. "They will," she said. "Some names are hard to shake off, but the name you have earned is one that tells the truth. It is heavier sometimes, but it can carry more." In the weeks and months that followed, the town's new measures held mostly because people had seen the cost of the alternative. Laws were written that required public accounting for transfers, and that created penalties for those who would treat people as property. The common house's apprenticeships grew into small businesses. The registry expanded slowly into a tool that kept track of transfers and ensured that any dispute was adjudicated publicly rather than quietly. Leadership changed in small ways. More women were given seat at the council table. A committee formed to oversee the welfare of those who had been freed. Cole did not reclaim all that he had lost. Roots shrank for a season, and his brand took time to be trusted again. But he found new markets among people who valued the ethics the town had started to practice. Some merchants who had once looked to shun him now brought their wagons to trade at the common house, finding new trust among those who insisted the old ways end. The freed women built lives not because the town suddenly became perfect, but because the structures that had enabled their captivity were confronted and given different forms. They were given choice, and where possible, support. They began to find agency in work, in education, in the simple arithmetic of being seen and named. The process of recovery was messy. There were days of relapse into fear, nights of distrust, and long conversations with those who had once kept silent. But the communal public work made those struggles less solitary. In the end, what saved them was not one man's body alone, nor a single dramatic wound, but a public reckoning that changed the calculus. Cole's sacrifice, he had taken the bullet, had been labelled traitor, had risked his livelihood, broke something open. It made the cost of maintaining the old order visible in a way that private talk never had. Men who had liked the certainty of ledgers could not stomach the thought that enforcement might mean the red cross of blood on a platform. The town chose, reluctantly and imperfectly, to protect people rather than profits. Mara's choice to come back and demand the light had been the engine. Cole's willingness to stand between her and the rifle had been the visible pivot. The elders' votes, the public testimonies of Celadon and Junash and others, and the slow, bureaucratic work of creating a registry and common house finished the work into something durable. On a plain warmed by late sun, Cole and Mara walked across the bridge together. They paused in the middle and looked out over the water as it carried small leaves and the quiet rumour of life. Children played on the far bank. A woman carrying tools laughed with a neighbour. The town no longer pretended that the rules of old were beyond change. Cole turned to Mara. "You asked me to stand beside you," he said. "I thought I only knew how to keep animals and ledgers. I am learning to keep a place where people can be free." Mara reached up and touched his scar as if feeling the map of a life. "We both did the things we had to," she replied. "You paid a cost. I claimed a space. The rest is work." They walked on, the bridge creaking underfoot, a simple sound that fit the slow, stubborn work of a town trying to be better. Behind them, people in the square debated finer points of law and the messy business of reparations. Ahead of them, the trail split into the ranges and the town's lane, both places Mara could walk between now without being catalogued as an asset. Cole had been called traitor by men who could not yet imagine another way. He had been willing to be that name if it meant the truth would be heard. His sacrifice, bearing the wound that made the cost of silence visible, was what tilted the town toward change. He did not anticipate honors or easy comforts. He expected, as he had taught himself to expect in the half-life of a farmer, a life measured in work. What he gained, what the town gained, was harder to count. The slow rebirth of accountability, the dignity of names spoken aloud, the knowledge that a person's life was not a column in a ledger. If you felt the weight of this story, of small, stubborn courage that forces a place to reckon, subscribe to follow more stories of hard choices and the people who make them. If this moved you, like and subscribe. Explore another story of courage on the screen now.